George Harrison never lost his cool. He seldom berated people in interviews. And yet, inside the Beatles, he bore a quiet resentment that darkened over the years. It was not public. It was not boisterous, but it was there. And it was personal. Beneath his meditative equanimity and spiritual explorations lay a grudge that never entirely mended. The quiet underdog. George Harrison was a school bus rider in Liverpool in the early 1960s, just a teenager. He was introduced to Paul McCartney. They had things in common, they exchanged records, and they liked skiffle and rock and roll alike. McCartney was older, wiser, and more forceful. George was shy and impressionable and was attracted to Paul's confidence and then John Lennon's genius. At age 15, he joined Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, when he signed up in 1958. Lennon initially believed that he was too young. McCartney had to organize a second audition on a bus where George impressed John with playing Ranchi's lead guitar line. That was the key to opening the door to what would be the most renowned band in history. But even at the beginning, George Harrison was entering someone else's narrative. Lennon and McCartney dominated the early identity of the band. They were the major songwriters. They created the vision. George trailed behind. He learned. He soaked it up. And for a time, that was sufficient. As the Beatles shot to fame, Harrison became known as the Quiet Beatle. Partly, it was the media idealizing his introversion. But to those around him, it was something more. A man who was starting to feel relegated, even smothered. He had music concepts. He had divine epiphanies. But in the recording studio, his vocals were too frequently submerged. When he suggested songs, they were rejected. When he suggested guitar chordings, they were second-guessed. Paul, above all, the perfectionist, had a way of hijacking. George would go on to state, "He ruined me as a guitar player, not out of malice, but from years of being subtly undermined." The Lennon-McCartney alliance wasn't only dominant. It was an empire in a band. George wasn't merely excluded, he was left behind. And as the band grew, the frustration within him hardened. What had begun as a respect mutated into resentment, and no one fanned that flame more than Paul McCartney. The breaking point in the studio, when the Beatles started recording the White Album in 1968, George Harrison was no longer satisfied to be the quiet contributor. He had developed as a songwriter, increasing in both confidence and aspiration. But within the studio, tensions were building. The chemistry had changed. Paul McCartney, driven and perfectionistic, had assumed a de facto leadership role. John Lennon was so self-absorbed with his new romance with Yoko Ono that he was becoming increasingly unpredictable. And George, he was sick of being neglected. Let It Be sessions in early 1969 revealed the fissures that had been developing for years. Cameras rolled as the group attempted to rehearse, but what they captured was more silent disintegration. One notorious exchange between George and Paul was recorded. Paul was attempting to guide Harrison's guitar break on the track Two of Us. Frustrated, George pushed back with a calm but deadly line, "I'll do what you want me to do, or I won't do anything at all if that's your wish." It wasn't a line of sarcasm. It was a line of resignation, a quiet white flag that read, "I'm not going to fight you, but I'm exhausted with this turn of events." To the rest of the world, it probably looked like a small argument, but to the people in the room, it was the culmination of years of suffocation of the creative process. Engineer Glenn John, who was present for the Let It Be sessions, later recalled the vibe being very unpleasant. The process had become a war zone, and George, no longer able to keep his frustration bottled up, temporarily walked out on the band on January 10, 1969. And what made it worse was that Paul didn't appear to realize the gravity of what he was doing. He wasn't cruel, merely controlling. McCartney had a vision, and he wanted everyone to adopt it, even if it meant bulldozing their ideas. George had finally had enough. After coming back to the band a few days later on new conditions, he started composing songs such as Something and Here Comes the Sun, masterpieces that showed what he could do when he was just left alone. But the harm wasn't reversed. The gap between George and Paul had become something more long-lasting. And though George did return to the band, part of him had already passed on. When friendship grew cold, the Beatles formally disbanded in 1970. But for George Harrison, the breakup wasn't only business. It was personal. As the media documented the catfight between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, Harrison was quietly severing his emotional connections with Paul. The fans witnessed nice interviews and stage get-togethers, but in private, George was wrestling to release the bitterness that had accumulated over years. Harrison released All Things Must Pass, a solo album packed with rejected and shelved songs while with the Beatles in 1971. It was a commercial and artistic success and did not go unrewarded by his former bandmates. There was one song in particular, Wawa, that excelled. At first glance, it seemed upbeat, but from a lyrical standpoint, it was acid-tipped. The song title was a metaphor for the emotional din and aggravation George went through, and most read the song as a veiled slap at Paul McCartney's controlling ways during their last days as a band. The acrimony didn't cease. In 1973, Harrison issued Sue May Sue You Blues, another tart commentary, this one concerning the litigation that ensued following the dissolution. Although the song had been directed at the group in general, there was no question that much of his anger had been focused on McCartney, who had filed the lawsuit to end the Beatles' business partnership. It was a move that needed to be made, but one that seemed like betrayal to Harrison, not only because of the court theatrics, but because it reaffirmed how far they had drifted apart. Even Harrison's former wife, Pattie Boyd, went on to say that George never really enjoyed Paul's personality. She recalled how George would come home from session work having had a rage about the constant bickering, particularly with Paul. They tolerated each other, she said, but I don't think that they really loved one another. From a professional standpoint, they made feeble attempts at working together again. In 1994, the surviving Beatles got back together for the anthology project, but still, old tendencies reasserted themselves. George remained hard to get along with. Behind closed doors, he rolled his eyes at McCartney's ideas, and Paul, being the diplomat that he is, publicly acknowledged that they still annoyed each other. Years had gone by, but the wounds had not yet healed. A guitar silenced. By the mid-1970s, George had established a successful solo career, but the wounds of his Beatles era still stung, particularly with regard to Paul McCartney. In a 1975 radio interview with Alan Freeman, George freely spoke of something few had ever heard him say out loud. I had no confidence in myself as a guitarist, having been with Paul for so long. He destroyed me as a guitar player. It was a piercing remark, subdued but cutting, trailing from a man held in high esteem for his guitar playing on tracks such as Something, and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, the remark reflected how emotionally debilitating those few years under McCartney's tutoring had been. George wasn't implying Paul had done it on purpose. What he was saying was that all those years of being overshadowed, second-guessed, and micromanaged had sucked the creative confidence out of him. He'd spent too many years playing someone else's idea, and not enough playing his own way. This intrapsychic conflict didn't just show itself in his playing, it showed itself in how he approached collaboration. During the same time, George admitted he would be happy to be in a band with John Lennon once again, but not with Paul. Paul is a great bass player, he explained, but sometimes he's rather overpowering. That was no slight. It was the reality of collaborating with a man whose perfectionism, too, often meant domination. For Harrison, the problem wasn't only music. It was about room, about being permitted to develop. And within the Beatles, there had been scant room for him. That dull, bitter discovery haunted him long after the applause had died down. Lennon, the open wound. Though George Harrison's frustrations against Paul McCartney were more apparent, his dynamic with John Lennon was probably more complex and, in numerous respects, more painful. In the early days of the Beatles, Harrison idolized Lennon. John was older, astute, and daring. George regarded him as a band member as well as a guide. Lennon, along with McCartney, had assisted in shaping Harrison's initial songwriting, even pushing him to try out structure and lyrics. That feeling of intimacy, however, steadily disappeared over the years. As Lennon became more engrossed in his personal life, especially in his affair with Yoko Ono, George felt emotionally excluded. John, who had once prided himself on his connection with George, drifted away, and unlike McCartney's overbearing studio persona, Lennon's apathy sliced in another direction. He ridiculed Harrison's increased fascination with Indian spirituality and music, treating it with sarcasm instead of interest. It stung. George had turned to meditation and Hindu philosophy as a means to peace and self-definition. But from Lennon, he got no more than eye rolls. The full extent of their estrangement was revealed in George's 1980 autobiography, I, Me, Mine. In more than 400 pages of autobiographical introspection, George barely uttered Lennon's name at all. Fans took notice, and it wasn't by mistake. The silence spoke volumes. Harisson subsequently acknowledged that John might have been a very trying individual and that their last few years together were frequently frosty. When Lennon was assassinated in December 1980, the shock shook George to the marrow. Yet even then, his eulogy was unsentimental and unnostalgic. But Harisson conveyed his sorrow through music. All those years ago, a song that was both tribute and veiled accounting. It recalled the initial bond, yes, but it did not deny that the pain had occurred. In subsequent interviews, Harisson portrayed Lean On more quietly. Time and age permit. In 1997, Harisson was diagnosed with throat cancer. He had radiation therapy and soon entered a period of remission, but the disease recurred, this time in his lungs and brain. During these last few years, he lived largely in private, passing time with his wife Olivia and son Donnie in their house in Friar Park, a large Victorian mansion in Henley-on-Thames. Even in poor health, George's sense of humor endured. In a 2001 Yahoo Online chat, one of his last major public outings, he was asked, "Does Paul still annoy you?" George didn't respond directly. Rather than that, he referenced an old Victorian proverb, "Sken not a friend with a microscopic glass." You know his faults, then let his foibles pass. It was classic Harisson, philosophical, elegant, but unmistakably incisive. As his illness advanced, Harisson had visits from old friends. One of them was Paul McCartney. The encounter was subdued and intimate. Paul later recalled how they sat together with their hands clasped, something neither would have done in their youth. "He was my baby brother," Paul has said in a 2008 interview. "We joked. We talked about silly things. It was like we were dreaming." George Harisson passed away on November 29, 2001 in a friend's house in Los Angeles with his loved ones around him. His last words, as told by Olivia, were easy to say, "Love one another." But even in death, the intricacies of his relationships continued. Although Paul mourned openly and talked fondly of George in interviews, tension between them had never fully vanished. The forgiveness, if any, was silent, partial, and maybe one-sided. George Harisson died, leaving behind a legacy of music, spiritual inquiry, and silent rebellion. He had never been the most vocal Beatle, but his hurt was genuine and his silence was deafening. Over the decades, there had been admiration, there had been love, but there had been resentment too. And ultimately, there were some individuals George Harisson just could never quite forgive. Do you believe that George and Paul ever actually reconciled before George died? Let us know in the comments. And if you like this tale, don't forget to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications for more untold music histories.